This happened a few years ago when my buddies and I were still young enough to go trick-or-treating. I live in a rural area of South Florida in a neighborhood that borders the Everglades. This made Halloween an entirely different experience. Imagine long stretches of swamps and marshlands with houses scattered throughout. The whole area is spooky enough at night, but when you add Halloween into the mix, it becomes something straight out of a horror movie. 3 of us were out that night, my friend Joey and our buddy Paul. I was dressed as a skeleton, Joey was Ron Weasley from Harry Potter, and Paul was some sort of zombie, I think. The good thing about trick-or-treating in the Everglades was it was naturally a creepy environment. The bad thing was, houses were scattered far apart, meaning it took a lot of walking to fill our bags with candy. As soon as it got dark, we headed out, down a long gravel road with marshland on the left and houses on the right. Our first stop was this nice little place where this friendly old man greeted us with bowls of assorted candy. We each grabbed a handful of whatever, stuffing our bags and making us feel we were off to a great start. The next house was a good hike away, but the woman who answered was very friendly and gave us a generous amount of candy. We hit another 6 houses as we covered nearly a half-mile, our bags gradually filling with lots of treats. We then encountered a smaller dirt road leading to a cluster of smaller houses and trailers. The first couple of homes were a bust, lights out, no sign of life, and no answer to our knocks. Next up was this rickety old place with a front yard lined with lighted pumpkins providing an eerie orange glow leading up to an old door. The house itself was so run down they didn't need much in the way of decorations to make it look haunted. On the ground next to the front door was an empty plastic pumpkin, presumably where the candy was placed. To the right was an old rocking chair with a sinister-looking witch sitting in it. Pinned to her long black cloak was a note that read, "If there's no more candy, enter through the back at your own risk." Joey turns to us and says something like, "Guys, let's get out of here." But Paul was all in, and honestly I was pretty pumped too. Maybe they had a scary haunted house set up out back with lots more candy. Who knows, but there was only one way to find out. With just a little peer pressure, Joey was convinced to go, and we all started walking around to the back of the house. The backyard was nearly pitch black, with just a single lit pumpkin sitting in the middle of the yard and a dimly lit yellow bulb hanging above the back door. Off to the left was a dilapidated wooden shed. Joey was getting antsy, saying this felt a little sketchy. I was starting to agree with him. Something just didn't feel right about this. As we looked around, I glanced up at the house's upstairs window and saw someone staring straight back at me. The moment our eyes met, they closed the blinds. I looked over at the shed and saw another face peering out of the cracked door. That's when I knew we had to get out of there. I peered over at Paul, who stood frozen, staring off into the marshlands. I followed his gaze and saw a figure emerging, wearing some sort of Friday the 13th mask and holding a machete. Before I could even react, the figure charged us, swinging the blade back and forth. I didn't know if this was part of the haunted house setup or not, but we all started running. As we headed around the front of the house, another individual was out there, extinguishing the lights in the pumpkins. As he saw us run by, he joined in on the chase. Between that psycho with the machete and now this dude, we ran as fast as we could down the dirt road, too afraid to look back. Adrenaline pumping, we kept going until we got back to my place. Collapsing from fear and exhaustion, I relayed to my parents what had happened. Shocked by what we told them, they immediately called the police. The cops arrived in a few minutes, and we led them out to the house. Everything, the lighted pumpkins, the candy bowl, the witch in the rocking chair, were gone. The house was completely empty. The next day, the police called to let us know the house had been vacant for months. Nobody was living there. It was as if the entire scene had been staged for some sinister purpose. This, of course, was the last time my buddies and I went trick-or-treating. Halloween used to be my favorite holiday, and although I grew too old for trick-or-treating, I still enjoyed all the costumes, haunted houses, and spooky parties. My street and the one next to it get a lot of trick-or-treaters, so my mom and I stopped by the store earlier that day to pick up an assortment of candies for the kids. I had plans to go to the movies that night with some friends to see the latest slasher pick. As I was getting ready, I also covered the front door for my mom, who was helping my little sister with her costume. As soon as it turned dark, the first wave of kids arrived, their costumes a mix of the adorable and the macabre. There were children from our street, the next street over, and some I didn't recognize. As I filled their bags with candy, I noticed among them an adult figure at the end of the path, dressed entirely in black, with a face mask that wasn't anything I recognized from a movie or anything. I guessed either a father or an older brother of one of the kids by their size. Anyway, after they all blurted out trick or treat, and I gave them their candy, they made their way back down the path and on to the next house. I was about to close the door when I noticed the guy with the kids was still standing at the end of the sidewalk. He hadn't moved and wasn't watching the children either. Instead, he was staring directly at me. His eyes, or the dark voids where his eyes should be, seemed to pull me in. My skin crawled, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I backed slowly into my house and watched him as he raised his hand and waved very slowly at me. I was about to call out to him when my mom came to the door to make sure I was all right. When he saw her, he turned and took off in the opposite direction from the way the kids went, vanishing into the shadows as if swallowed by the night itself. It seemed he hadn't been with them at all, and only left when he realized I wasn't home alone. I was completely freaked out and told my friend about it when he swung by the house to pick me up for the movie. The incident slipped my mind as the film unfolded, its horrors temporarily overshadowing my real-life encounter. When I got home, it was late and the streets were deserted, trick-or-treating truly over for the year. My mom was about to take our dogs out, who seemed unusually anxious for their last walk of the night. She would also meet up with my dad, who was just leaving work. My sister was already upstairs asleep in bed, stuffed with candy and exhausted from the excitement. I rummaged through her bag of candy and headed upstairs to my bedroom, texting my friends about the movie we had just seen. The house now eerily quiet. A couple years ago, my dad had installed motion sensor lights around the outside of the house. It usually goes off whenever a cat or whatever walks along our fence, but it turns off after a couple of minutes. I always know when the light has come on because it lights up about half my room, given where he had placed it. I was lying on my bed, scrolling through my phone when the light came on. I initially ignored it because I knew it would soon go off, but after 5 minutes, it still hadn't gone off. So, I pulled aside my blinds to have a look outside and see what was going on. My stomach dropped when I saw that creep from hours before sitting on my fence, waving his arms to keep the light on. His waving slowed down suddenly when he spotted me, and even through the mask, he seemed to be grinning. Our eyes met briefly before I recoiled from the window, letting the drapes shut. I was sitting on my bed staring wide-eyed at the window, my mind racing about who he was and what he wanted. Terrified, I was about to run to my little sister's room to check on her when I heard the front door open. I froze, fearing that Psycho had just entered the house. Relief washed over me when I heard my mom and dad talking. I rushed downstairs, my voice tinged with hysteria, screaming about the man on the fence in the backyard. My dad didn't hesitate. Flipping the backyard lights on, he opened the door, the dogs bolting past him barking and growling. He shouted at the man to get out of here or he'd call the cops. The man disappeared into the shadows, letting out a low, guttural laugh that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Later that night, as I lay in bed, unable to get the thoughts of that man out of my head, the motion sensor light flickered on again. I was still being watched. I could feel it. I was in my early 20s, recently graduated from college, and living with 2 roommates in a small house just across the river from a major city. My roommate, Steven, owned the house and occupied the master bedroom on the 2nd floor. My other roommate, Tyler, had a bedroom on the 1st floor, and I rented the bedroom in the converted basement. As a kid, I was always a big fan of Halloween, but being an adult with a full-time job, it wasn't ideal for me to go out and attend Halloween parties. Also, Halloween fell on a Wednesday this year, so instead, Tyler and I decided to watch some horror movies on the big screen TV I put up in my basement bedroom. After we watched a couple of movies, we started to get a little bored. At about 11 p.m., the trick-or-treaters were home, and most people were in for the night. Knowing we had to work in the morning, we decided it would be a good idea to take a quick walk around the neighborhood, see some decorations, and get some fresh air before calling it a night. There was a small park that sat right in the middle of our neighborhood. The park had a main entrance from one of the busier streets and a back entrance from the street we lived on. The back entrance was covered with a lot of trees in a very small wooded area. About 50 yards from the main entrance were 3 soccer fields, a jungle gym, and a basketball court. I had been through the park 100 times and shot hoops on the basketball court dozens of times after work and on weekends. At this time of the night, the neighborhood and park were quiet and somewhat desolate. We entered the park through the wooded area and back, and it was nearly pitch black, with only a sliver of moonlight making its way through the thick trees. As we walked through the wooded area, we both stopped abruptly. We thought we saw a man standing at the end of the path. The figure was completely still, and it was so dark we couldn't be sure what it was. I called out, "Hey," to the figure, but no response. I suggested we should turn around, but Tyler said we should check it out, being the braver of the two of us. As we got closer, it was clear a man was standing there. He was completely still and had both hands in his front hoodie pocket. His head was down, and the hoodie was pulled over his head. Trying not to freak out, we decided to slowly back up and make our way to the streets and our house without further confrontation. Before we even moved, we heard a noise next to us coming from both sides. Peering into the darkness, we saw two more figures moving towards us from the tree line. Unlike the other guy who just standing there, these people were approaching us. At this point, I got a strong sinking feeling in my gut, and my heart started beating rapidly. Fight or flight kicked in. Without a word, we both turned and sprinted full speed out of that park and onto our street, never looking back to see if they were following us. We ran right to our house and locked the doors behind us. While sitting in the basement, we had all the lights off. We looked out the windows to see if anyone followed us or possibly saw which house we went into. We were both scared and trying to process what had happened. Were we in real danger, or was this just someone playing a Halloween prank? After about 20 minutes, we decided that no one was following us and that it was probably just some guys having fun at our expense. Considering we both had work the following day, we thought we better just get some sleep. At about 1 a.m. in the morning, Tyler wakes me up. He said he heard something outside his bedroom window. I climb the stairs and enter his bedroom to take a look. I could see a pumpkin in the middle of the backyard through the dim lights. This was strange because we didn't have any pumpkins outside our house. In fact, we didn't have any Halloween decorations up at all. We went back into the living room and looked out the front window. Standing in the middle of the street were three men staring at our house. We hadn't turned on any lights inside, so we didn't think they could see us. Tyler and I looked at each other, unsure what to do. I grabbed a baseball bat and we sat in the living room, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. We thought about calling the police, but standing in the middle of the road was hardly a crime. And we weren't even sure if they had thrown the pumpkin into our backyard or not. After about 10 minutes, we looked out the window again, and the three men were gone, or so we hoped. For the remainder of the night, we stayed in the living room, checking the windows out front and back in case they showed up again. Eventually, we both dozed off. Morning finally came, and as we got ready for work, we agreed it was probably just a Halloween prank, and we should forget about the whole thing. As I walked to my car, I decided to grab the pumpkin lying in the backyard and throw it away. As I approached, I noticed it had been crudely hollowed out with a wicked face carved into it. As I picked it up, the top fell off. I gasped, immediately dropping the pumpkin. Inside was a severed hand. Between the fingers was a note that said, "Good thing you lock your doors."